It was upon one of those raw and reluctant mornings of late November, when London seems fashioned not of brick and stone, but of vapour and soot, that I became again the chronicler of an adventure which, for its singular audacity and the trembling shadow it casts across the highest office in the empire, has never ceased to haunt my recollection. Our rooms in Baker Street were the accustomed refuge from such weather. The coal in the grate burned with a steady heart, and the familiar odour of tobacco, Holmes's shag mixed with my own milder blend, hung in the air like the ghost of yesterday's conversation. Holmes lay at full length upon the sofa, his long, nervous hands folded beneath his cheek, his eyes half closed in that curious attitude of repose which with him signified not idleness, but the most intense activity of mind. And I had scarcely finished the perusal of a medical circular, an unpromising paper which yet held my professional conscience, when a violent peal at the bell sent Mrs. Hudson's footsteps scurrying along the passage. A moment later, she ushered in a visitor whose presence, even before a word was spoken, brought with it a chill more penetrating than the fog outside. He was a man of 50 years or thereabouts, spare and erect, with iron-grey whiskers trimmed to military neatness. His black frock coat was of excellent cut, yet his gloves were creased, and his hat bore the faint, damp stain of hurried travel. In his bearing there was the rigid propriety of an official long accustomed to rooms where whispers must never become words. But it was his eyes, restless, watchful, haunted, that betrayed the pressure under which he laboured. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" said he. Holmes rose in an instant, all languor discarded, and inclined his head with that airy courtesy which sat so oddly upon his angular figure. "You have found him," said he. "This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray take that chair by the fire. You have been in the open air and are chilled." The man stared. Yes," he murmured. "How could you know that?" Holmes's lips curved. "Your right sleeve is speckled with damp grit, such as one obtains by brushing too near the wheels of a cab in wet weather. Your boots are clean upon the uppers, but wet at the seams. London stones do that. And you hold your hat as if you had only this moment removed it, yet you have not taken off your gloves. That is the habit of a man who has been compelled to hurry from place to place and has had no leisure for comfort. Now, your name?" The visitor drew a breath as one who resigns himself to the inevitable. "My name is Percival Eames," said he quietly. "I serve in the private secretary's office." Holmes's expression altered, though only I, who had watched him in so many moods, perceived the sharpening of his attention. "Indeed," said he. "Then our business is not a trivial one." "It is not," returned Mr. Eames, lowering his voice, though no ears could possibly have been within those walls save our own. "I am here upon a matter which touches the crown." At that, I confess my heart gave a bound. Holmes, however, merely waved his hand towards the chair. "Proceed," said he. "The crown has many touches, Mr. Eames, and some of them are surprisingly dirty." Eames coloured, whether at the freedom of Holmes's tone or at the truth beneath it, I cannot say. "Or yesterday evening," said he, "a letter addressed to Her Majesty was delivered with the usual bag. It bore a familiar seal, a crest used by a certain provincial dignitary, and the handwriting appeared at first glance to be that of the sender. It passed through the ordinary hands. There was nothing to rouse suspicion." "Until," said Holmes, "until Her Majesty's private secretary, Sir Renwick Harrowby, opened it." Holmes's fingers interlaced. "And what occurred?" Eames swallowed. Sir Renwick had scarcely unfolded the second page when he grew pale, so pale that the colour seemed to drain from him like water from a basin. He steadied himself upon the desk, attempted to speak, and then collapsed. He was carried to his chambers and attended by the household physician. By midnight, he was dead. A silence settled upon the room, unbroken only by the hiss of the fire. I, who had seen death in the field and in the hospitals of London, felt nevertheless a tightening at my throat, for I had seen men die by bullet and by fever, but the notion of death creeping from a simple sheet of paper seemed to me the very embodiment of invisible horror. "You have brought me the letter," said Holmes. Eames started. I did not say so. "You did not need to," said Holmes coolly. "You keep your left hand in your coat as if supporting something flat. Also, your anxiety is of the kind which belongs to a man carrying danger. Pray be careful. If your account is accurate, you have a weapon upon your person." With a stiff motion, Eames drew from within his coat a large envelope, secured with string and wax, and set it upon the table as one might place down a snake. "We dare not destroy it," he whispered. "We dare not keep it, and we dare not admit, beyond a very few, that such a thing has occurred. There are men, foreign men, who would pay fortunes for the knowledge that a letter may reach so near to the throne." Holmes bent over it, but did not touch. "Poison," said he softly, "and intended not for Sir Renwick, but for the Queen." Eames's face contorted with dread. "Yes," he said, "Her Majesty did not open it because Sir Renwick, as is his duty, reads first. If the poison was meant for him, it is assassination. If it was meant for Her Majesty, it is treason," said Holmes, and his voice, for once, had lost its playful edge. At that moment, as if summoned by the very word, there came from the street below the distant clatter of hoofs and a shouted command. Holmes's head lifted like a hound's at a horn. "Or someone else has taken an interest," said he. "Watson, fetch your coat. Mr. Eames, you have done right to come, but you have also brought the wolves to our door." Holmes crossed the room in 3 noiseless strides and drew aside the curtain by the merest fraction. I joined him, though I could perceive little beyond the murk of the street lamps diffused through fog. Yet he, whose eyes seemed fashioned for such half-light, gave a faint grunt of recognition. "A government brougham," he murmured, "and the driver wears no livery. Our visitor has not come unobserved." Mr. Eames rose halfway from his chair, his composure shaken. "It cannot be known, surely it cannot be known that I am here?" Holmes released the curtain and turned back with the ghost of a smile. "My dear sir, when a senior official leaves his office under unusual circumstances and hastens across London without escort, it is observed. You serve in a house where observation is a profession. Sit down. If the gentlemen below are who I suppose, they will ascend directly." He had scarcely spoken when Mrs. Hudson's tread was again audible upon the stair, followed by a firm and official knock. Holmes, with an air of languid hospitality, called them in. Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand, his keen features set in lines of impatience. Behind him stood a taller, broader man, heavy in the jaw and eye, whose black coat bore the unmistakable cut of Whitehall tailoring. He inclined his head curtly. "Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, "I trust we do not intrude." "You invariably do, but rarely without entertainment," Holmes returned pleasantly. "Pray be seated." "Did I believe you are acquainted with Mr. Percival Eames?" The taller man's gaze fixed upon our client. "Mr. Eames," said he, "you were instructed to remain within the precincts." "I was instructed," Eames replied with sudden firmness, "to preserve discretion. In that I have obeyed both the letter and the spirit of my orders." Holmes's eyes flickered with approval at the unconscious pun. "And you, sir?" Holmes inquired. "Sir Matthew Corbin," said the man stiffly. "Under Secretary of State, We are here because a matter of extreme delicacy has been—" He glanced at Eames, expanded. Holmes gestured toward the sealed envelope upon the table. "The expansion lies there." Lestrade's sharp glance fell upon it. "You've not opened it." "I have not touched it," said Holmes. "I prefer my fingers alive." Sir Matthew's brows contracted. Then you accept the conclusion that poison was employed?" Holmes steepled his long fingers. "I accept nothing. I observe that a healthy man read a letter and died within hours, exhibiting pallor and collapse. I am told no wound was found. That suggests either an ingested toxin or a contact agent. Since Sir Renwick merely handled the document, the latter is probable." Lestrade nodded. The household physician reported no marks of violence. There was some irritation upon the fingertips and a slight discoloration at the lips. "Ah," said Holmes softly. "Did Sir Renwick, by chance, moisten his fingers to separate the pages?" Sir Matthew started. "He had that habit, yes. Many men do." "An unfortunate economy," Holmes replied. "Sherm, it suggests that the poison was applied to the edges of the sheets, perhaps an alkaloid capable of rapid absorption through the mucous membrane." A chill ran through me as he spoke. "Holmes," I said, "if that be so, then the danger is not past. The envelope must be examined with precautions," he finished. "Watson, you will oblige me by fetching the small chemical case from the cabinet and the pair of india-rubber gloves from the drawer." While I complied, Lestrade shifted restlessly. "We have already detained the sender," said he, "a provincial magistrate named Alistair Penwood. The crest upon the seal is his." "And his motive?" Holmes asked without looking up. "None apparent," Lestrade admitted. "He is a loyal subject, well regarded. He swears the letter he posted contained a petition regarding railway tariffs and nothing more." Holmes's lips twitched. "A petition so compelling as to cause instantaneous death. Admirable efficiency." Sir Matthew's tone hardened. "This is no time for levity, Mr. Holmes." "On the contrary," said Holmes lightly, slipping on the gloves I handed him. "It is precisely the time. Panic is the ally of the criminal. Logic is ours." With infinite care, he cut the string and unfolded the waxed wrapping. Within lay the envelope proper, its surface unremarkable, save for the red crest impressed upon the flap. Holmes held it to the light, then to his nose, but did not inhale deeply. "No obvious odour," he observed. "Watson, the forceps." He withdrew the folded sheets and laid them flat upon a glass plate. The handwriting was bold and masculine, and Holmes bent close, his keen gaze travelling not over the words, but along the margins. "There," he said at last. I leaned forward. Along the outer edges of the paper, scarcely visible, was a faint crystalline sheen. Holmes touched the corner with the tip of a moistened litmus slip from his case. The paper blushed faintly. "Acidic," he murmured. "Yet that proves little." He scraped the minutest fragment into a small vial, added a drop from another bottle, and watched intently. A pale cloud formed. "Curious," he whispered. Lestrade could contain himself no longer. "Well?" Holmes straightened. "It is consistent with aconitine, or a preparation closely allied to it, a vegetable poison, exceedingly potent. Ingestion of even a small quantity may produce the symptoms described." Sir Matthew drew a slow breath. Then the letter was meant to kill?" "Yes," said Holmes, removing the gloves with delicate precision. "But not necessarily the man who died." Lestrade frowned. "You think it was meant for the Queen after all?" Holmes regarded him with that expression of patient superiority which so often exasperated the inspector. "I think," said he, "that if the sender wished to murder Sir Renwick Harrowby, he would not have addressed the envelope to Her Majesty. That introduces unnecessary hazard. No, the addressee was the intended victim. Sir Renwick was an obstacle, an unforeseen one. Sir Matthew's face blanched. Then we face an attempt upon the sovereign's life. We face, Holmes corrected gently, an attempt which has already failed. The question is whether the architect of that attempt knows it has failed and what he will do next. As if in answer, there came a second knock at the door, more hurried than the first. Mrs. Hudson's voice trembled in the passage. "Mr. Holmes, there is a telegraph boy below. He says it is urgent, from Windsor." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sudden, dangerous light. "Watson," said he quietly, "the game advances. Let us see how." Holmes did not move at once. He stood for the briefest instant with his head inclined, as though measuring the weight of events against some inner scale. Then he turned to Mrs. Hudson. "Show the boy up," said he, "and if you please, no one else." The lad entered, breathless, cap in hand, his cheeks flushed from haste and cold alike. He held out a folded telegram which bore the royal crest. Sir Matthew stepped forward instinctively, but Holmes intercepted it with a quiet gesture. "With your permission," he said. Sir Matthew hesitated only a fraction before nodding. Holmes slit the envelope and scanned the message. As his eyes moved across the lines, I observed a subtle tightening about his mouth. "Well?" demanded Lestrade. Holmes handed the telegram to Sir Matthew without comment. The Under-Secretary read it swiftly, and a muffled oath escaped him. "It has happened again," he said hoarsely. "A second letter, addressed to Her Majesty, arrived this morning at Windsor." Eames uttered a low cry. "Opened?" "No," Sir Matthew replied. "On your instructions, no correspondence is to be handled until further notice. It lies sealed." Holmes's gaze flickered to the first letter upon the table.
Then our adversary moves with admirable confidence. He assumes the first attempt succeeded. Failing news to the contrary, he repeats the method. Lestrade bristled. "Or he wishes to ensure the deed." Holmes shook his head. "Redundancy is a luxury in crime, Inspector. A second letter increases risk without proportionate gain, unless it serves another purpose." "Which is?" Lestrade demanded. "To test the security of the channel," Holmes replied, "or to create confusion as to origin." Sir Matthew folded the telegram with care that betrayed agitation. "Mr. Holmes, you must come to Windsor at once." Holmes glanced at the clock upon the mantel. "There is a train within the hour. Watson, you will accompany me." "Certainly." Lestrade cleared his throat. "And I?" "You will," said Holmes. "Continue your interrogation of Mr. Alistair Penwood, but with a slight alteration." Lestrade's brows rose. "Indeed." "You will inform him," Holmes continued, "that Sir Renwick Harrowby lingers between life and death, but he is dead." "Precisely. Observe Mr. Penwood's reaction. If he be innocent, he will display horror and relief in equal measure. If guilty, he may betray disappointment or fear that his design has miscarried." Lestrade regarded Holmes for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "Very well." Within 40 minutes, Watson and Holmes were seated in a first-class carriage bound for Windsor, the countryside sliding past in wan November hues. Holmes had secured the poisoned letter within a tin dispatch box borrowed from Sir Matthew, and now sat opposite me, long legs crossed, eyes closed. "You are not asleep?" I ventured.
"My dear Watson," he replied without opening his eyes, "I never sleep when a problem is unfolding." "Then you have formed a theory?" "I have formed several. They contend within my mind like barristers before a judge." I leaned forward. "You believe Penwood innocent?" "I believe nothing without evidence. Yet consider, the seal bore his crest. The handwriting resembles his. The letter contains a plausible petition, all too convenient. If I wish to cast suspicion upon a loyal magistrate, I should employ precisely such devices. You suggest forgery? I suggest imitation, said Holmes. A skilled hand, access to wax and seal, none beyond procurement. And the poison? Applied after composition. Observe that the crystalline residue lay chiefly along the outer edges. The interior lines bore little trace. That implies the toxin was brushed upon the folded sheets, not incorporated during writing. I pondered this, and the perpetrator must have intercepted the letter after it was written, or created it entirely, Holmes returned. We shall know more when we compare the second. The train drew into Windsor with a shriek of steam. We were met upon the platform by a discreet official who conducted us through side entrances and quiet corridors until we reached a small antechamber adjoining the private office. There upon a polished table lay the second envelope. It was, to all appearance, identical to the first. Holmes examined it without delay. The crest, penwards, the address, firm and bold. Yet I saw his fingers pause at the lower right corner. "What is it?" I whispered. "A smudge," he said softly, all but barely perceptible. He held the envelope toward the window where pale daylight filtered in. There, against the creamy paper, was the faintest crescent mark, as though a thumb, stained with some dark substance, had pressed and withdrawn. "Watson," he murmured, "do you observe the shape?" "A partial print?" "Precisely. Not the whirl of a labourer nor the blunt pad of a clerk. This is narrow, almost tapering." Sir Matthew, who stood close by, leaned in. "You can deduce that?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "I deduce only that our criminal is no careless rustic. He handles poison and parchment with equal familiarity." He donned the gloves once more and opened the envelope with measured care. As before, the sheets within bore that treacherous sheen along their margins. "Untouched," Holmes said. "In the same method." He scraped a sample and performed the brief chemical test. The pale cloud bloomed again. "Consistent," he murmured. "Our author is methodical." Sir Matthew exhaled slowly. "Then we have confirmation of a deliberate campaign." "Yes," said Holmes, "and a miscalculation." He placed the letter down and turned to the window, gazing out upon the grey sweep of the castle grounds. "Our adversary believes Sir Renwick dead and the Queen ignorant of danger. He repeats his device, assuming no alteration in procedure. That suggests he has not received intelligence from within these walls since yesterday." Sir Matthew stiffened. "You imply an accomplice?" Holmes did not look back. "I imply," said he quietly, "that if there were one, he would not risk a second dispatch so soon. No, this is the work of a man outside the inner circle, or a man who relies upon routine." "And how does that assist us?" Sir Matthew asked. Holmes turned at last, and in his eyes I saw the quickened fire that always signalled the chase. "It assists us," said he, "because routine leaves tracks. We must discover where both letters entered the chain and who stood nearest to them before they reached their destination. In that narrow interval lies our culprit." He paused, and a faint smile touched his lips. "And I believe, Sir Matthew, that the interval is shorter than you suppose." Sir Matthew regarded Holmes with an expression compounded of impatience and reluctant hope. "You speak of an interval," said he. "Be so good as to define it." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace the length of the chamber. "Both letters," he replied, "bear the crest and hand of Mr. Alistair Penwood. Both were delivered through ordinary channels without arousing suspicion. The poison was applied after the sheets were written and folded. Therefore, the critical moment lies between composition and final sealing, or, if sealed at once, between dispatch and official receipt." Sir Matthew frowned. Penwood posted the first from his town in Surrey. The second, according to the Windsor Telegraph, was posted from the same locality yesterday afternoon. Just so, said Holmes. Then we must determine who handled the letters between Penwood's posting and their arrival within these walls. He turned abruptly. I require a precise account of the postal route. Sir Matthew summoned a clerk who arrived with ledgers detailing the movement of correspondence. King Holmes listened intently as the man described the chain: collection at the provincial office, sorting at the district depot, transfer by rail to London, central sorting at Mount Pleasant, and final dispatch in sealed bags to the palace and to Windsor respectively. Holmes interrupted only once. At what point, he asked, would the bag destined for the private secretary's office be accessible? The clerk hesitated. It remains sealed from the central sorting office until it reaches the palace messenger, sir. And the seal? Holmes inquired. Applied at Mount Pleasant, bearing the office stamp. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Then either the poison was applied before the letters entered the sealed bag, or the seal was compromised. Sir Matthew stiffened. And the integrity of the Royal Mail is not lightly impugned. I impugn nothing, Holmes replied calmly. I inquire. He stepped to the table where the first envelope lay within its protective box. This crest, he said, tapping it lightly, is authentic. Yet authenticity proves only access. A crest may be impressed by any man who possesses the seal, or an impression thereof. Sir Matthew's expression sharpened. Penwood keeps his seal in his study. He swears it has not left his possession. Swears, Holmes repeated softly. Has his household been questioned? His servants, yes, nothing suspicious. Holmes nodded as though this confirmed some private supposition. And Penwood himself, what is his profession? A magistrate of modest estate, educated, loyal, without known enemies. Without known enemies, Holmes echoed. That phrase has concealed many. He turned once more to the second envelope, studying the faint crescent smudge. This mark, he said, was made after the poison was applied. Note that it lies partly upon the crystalline residue. Therefore the hand which left it handled the treated paper. You suggest, I ventured, that the criminal touched the letter after poisoning it. Precisely, Watson, and thereby risked his own life, unless he wore protection. Sir Matthew's gaze flickered to the gloves upon Holmes's hands. Gloves leave no prints. Most do not, Holmes agreed, but thin kid, dampened by exertion, may betray a contour. He leaned closer to the smudge. This is no glove mark. The faint ridge suggests bare skin, yet the poison did not incapacitate him. Lestrade's earlier report returned to my mind. Holmes, you said aconitine is rapidly absorbed. It is, he replied, but absorption requires moisture. Sir Renwick, by moistening his fingers, invited it. A dry touch might escape immediate harm, particularly if the quantity were minute. Sir Matthew folded his arms. Then our man is either reckless or confident. Confident, said Holmes at once. Recklessness leaves broader traces. He straightened. I must see Mr. Penwood? Sir Matthew hesitated. He's under guard in London. Then we return at once, Holmes replied. But before we depart, I would examine the bag in which this letter arrived. Within minutes, we were conducted to a small room where the canvas mailbag lay upon a bench. The official seal of Mount Pleasant was intact. Holmes inspected it with meticulous care, then passed a lens over the cord and wax. No disturbance, he murmured. If tampered with, it was done with consummate skill, or before sealing. He examined the interior seams of the bag, running his gloved fingers along the stitching. Canvas absorbs little, he observed. There is no trace of powder within. Therefore the letter was treated before insertion. Sir Matthew drew a slow breath. At the provincial office, then? Or in Penwood's own study? Holmes replied evenly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. You incline again toward his guilt? Sir Matthew asked. I incline toward proximity, Holmes answered. Let us consider. If Penwood wrote the letter and sealed it immediately, he alone possessed it until posting. If another wished to substitute or alter it, he must gain access either in the house or at the post. And you think the interval short? I said, or Holmes's eyes gleamed. Very short. Observe the postmark. He held up the envelope. The stamp bore the date and hour, 3 in the afternoon. The train to London departs that town at 4, Holmes continued. Therefore the letter must have been posted not long before collection. If poisoned at the post office, it would require a clerk both corrupt and swift. Sir Matthew's jaw tightened. You suspect a government employee. I suspect opportunity, Holmes replied. We left Windsor without further delay and returned to London by the afternoon train. The winter light was fading as we reached Scotland Yard, where Lestrade awaited us with visible impatience. Well? He demanded. Mr. Penwood? Holmes asked. In the interrogation room. And your experiment? Lestrade's lips thinned. When informed that Sir Renwick lived, Hannay appeared genuinely relieved. When I added that the Queen herself was unharmed, he wept. Holmes inclined his head. That argues strongly for innocence. Lestrade grunted. Or consummate acting. Holmes did not answer, but requested that Penwood be brought before us. The magistrate entered, pale yet composed, his eyes red from strain. Mr. Holmes, said he earnestly, I implore you, whatever has been done in my name, I am no party to it. Holmes studied him in silence, then spoke with measured gentleness. Mr. Penwood, I have but one question for the present. After you wrote and sealed your letter, did it leave your sight before you posted it? Penwood hesitated. It lay upon my desk for perhaps half an hour while I dressed to go out. Was anyone in the room? My housekeeper entered to lay the fire. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Alone? Yes. And the door? Unlatched. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. Mr. Penwood, said he quietly, you may have been the unwitting instrument of a design far darker than you suppose. I must visit your house at once. Penwood stared. Tonight? Tonight, Holmes replied. For if I am correct, the hand that brushed poison upon your letter did so within your very walls. Within the hour, we were once more upon the railway, this time bound for the quiet Surrey town in which Mr. Alastair Penwood resided. The journey passed in thoughtful silence. Holmes sat with his chin upon his breast, long fingers tapping faintly against his knee in that irregular rhythm which I had learned to associate with concentrated analysis. Penwood, who accompanied us under Lestrade's watchful eye, seemed torn between dread and a desperate hope that his domestic sanctity might yet be preserved from scandal. Night had fallen by the time we reached the modest yet well-appointed house which stood a little apart from the high street, its windows glowing faintly against the chill. A thin mist clung to the hedgerows, and the gravel of the drive crunched sharply beneath our boots. Penwood admitted us with his own key. A maid, pale and wide-eyed, appeared in the passage, but at a quiet word from her master withdrew. Holmes requested that the household be assembled in the dining-room. Presently there stood before us Mrs. Darley, the housekeeper, a stout woman of middle years with a capable expression, a footman scarcely out of boyhood, and the maid we had glimpsed upon entry. Holmes regarded them each in turn, his gaze lingering a fraction longer upon Mrs. Darley. "Mr. Penwood informs me," said he evenly, "that upon the afternoon in question he composed a letter in his study and left it upon the desk for approximately half an hour before posting it. During that interval, Mrs. Darley, you entered to attend the fire?" "I did, sir," she replied with steady composure. "The coals were low." "You were alone?" "Yes, sir." "And you approached the desk?" Her brow furrowed. "Only so far as to pass it, sir. I had no cause to touch his papers." Holmes inclined his head. "Quite so, and yet the door was unlatched. Could any other have entered unobserved?" The footman shifted uneasily. "I was in the yard, sir." "And I in the scullery," murmured the maid. Holmes dismissed them with a courteous nod, retaining only Mrs. Darley. "Madam," said he gently, "I forgive the intrusion, but I must ask whether any visitor called that day." She hesitated the briefest instant. "A gentleman did, sir, a Mr. Edgar Blythe, a distant cousin of Mr. Penwood's, as I understand." Penwood started. "Blythe? He has not visited in months." "He came shortly after luncheon, sir," Mrs. Darley insisted. "You were occupied, and he waited in the drawing-room near an hour." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Did he enter the study?" "I cannot say, sir. I was in and out with the coal scuttle." Penwood pressed a hand to his brow. "Blythe has been in some financial embarrassment. I declined him assistance before." Holmes turned sharply. "Describe him." "A man of 35, Penwood replied slowly. "Tall, slight, somewhat nervous in manner, dark hair, narrow hands." "Narrow hands," Holmes repeated softly, and he requested to see the study. We entered a comfortable room lined with books and dominated by a large oak desk near the window. Holmes moved about it with silent intensity, examining the surface, the inkstand, the blotter. "Where did the letter lie?" he asked. "Here." Penwood indicated the centre of the desk. Holmes bent low. "Watson, the lens." I handed it to him. He scrutinized the polished wood along the edge of the blotter, then the brass of the inkwell. At last he paused, lifting a tiny object between his fingers. It was no more than a flake, scarcely visible. "Crystal residue?" he murmured. Penwood recoiled. "Here!" Holmes nodded. "Minute, but present. The poison was applied in this room." Mrs. Darley uttered a faint exclamation and clasped her apron. Holmes straightened. "Mr. Penwood, when Mr. Blythe waited in the drawing-room, or did you at any point leave him unattended?" "I did," Penwood admitted. "I was called briefly to the yard regarding a matter with the stable." "And your study door?" "Unlocked." Holmes's expression grew intent. "Then Mr. Blythe possessed opportunity." Lestrade folded his arms. "Motive?" Penwood's voice trembled. "If the Queen were harmed by a letter bearing my crest, I should be ruined, disgraced beyond recovery." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely. A man in debt might profit from your downfall. Inheritance, perhaps?" Penwood's face drained of colour. "He's next in line to a modest entail." Holmes paced once across the rug. "And if suspicion rested upon you, the disgrace would extinguish your claim, leaving the estate uncontested." Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "Or you think he meant not only regicide, but to secure his own fortune?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that he meant to eliminate two obstacles with one device, the sovereign and his cousin." Mrs. Darley wrung her hands. "But, sir, would a gentleman stoop to such wickedness?" Holmes's voice was cool. "Madam, wickedness is no respecter of birth." He turned abruptly to Penwood. "Where is Mr. Blythe now?" "I do not know. He lodges in London when funds permit." Holmes considered a moment. "Watson, observe the window." I stepped closer. The lower sash bore faint smears near the latch. "Recently handled," Holmes said. "If Blythe entered the study unseen, he might equally have quitted it by the window when he heard your return." Penwood stared. "But that overlooks the garden." Holmes gave a thin smile. And what is a garden to a desperate man? He examined the soil beneath the window with the aid of a lamp brought by the footman. Though the ground was firm, a faint indentation remained near the flower bed, too slight for certainty, yet suggestive. Holmes rose. "Inspector, we must find Mr. Edgar Blythe without delay. If he has learned that Sir Renwick died and no more, he may believe his plan partially achieved. But once he discovers that suspicion has shifted, he will attempt escape." Lestrade nodded grimly. "I shall telegraph London." Holmes replaced the tiny crystalline flake within a small envelope. "This residue upon the desk is decisive. The poison was not applied at the post office nor in transit, but here, within this study, while the letter lay unattended." Penwood sank into a chair, his composure shaken to its core. Holmes's gaze softened for a fleeting instant. "Take courage, sir. The net draws tight, and I suspect that Mr. Blythe's narrow hands have already left us more than one trace." As we departed the house into the cold night air, Holmes quickened his pace toward the station. "Watson," he said quietly, "if I am correct, our man will not flee abroad. He lacks the means. He will seek refuge where anonymity is greatest." "In London?" "In London," Holmes affirmed. "And before dawn breaks we must be upon his trail." The return journey to London was undertaken with all possible haste, Lestrade having dispatched telegrams ahead to his men with instructions to make discreet inquiries at such lodgings as Edgar Blythe was known to frequent. Holmes spoke little during the ride, yet I observed that his earlier air of speculation had given way to something firmer, an inward certainty that the outlines of the case were resolving into clarity. "You are confident," I ventured, as the train roared through the darkness. "I am confident of the method," he replied. "The motive, though plausible, must be tested. Blythe sought to compromise Penwood irretrievably. The death of Sir Renwick was, in his mind, collateral, useful insofar as it suggested the Queen herself was the target." "And yet," I said, "if the Queen had perished—" Holmes's eyes opened, sharp even in the dim carriage light. "Then the outrage would have been immeasurable. But consider the calculation. If the first letter succeeded, chaos would follow. In chaos, blame might settle swiftly upon Penwood, whose seal and handwriting authenticated the crime. Or Blythe would inherit unchallenged. If the attempt failed, he would repeat it, as he did, believing the initial design sound." "You think he did not know of Sir Renwick's death before sending the second?" "Impossible," Holmes replied. "The second letter was posted the afternoon of the first's arrival. News of the private secretary's collapse would not have reached him so swiftly unless he possessed a confederate within the palace, which our examination renders unlikely. Therefore he acted in ignorance, assuming the letter had been opened by its intended recipient." We reached London shortly before midnight. A constable awaited us upon the platform with word that Blythe had been traced to a boarding-house in Bloomsbury some weeks prior, though he was not presently there, and the landlady recalled that he had lately spoken of securing employment through a pharmaceutical supplier near Holborn. Holmes's expression brightened faintly. "A supplier, you say?" "Yes, sir," the constable replied. "Chemicals and tinctures." Holmes turned to me. "Aconitine is not procured from the hedgerow. It requires knowledge and access." Within half an hour we stood before a narrow shop whose shuttered windows bore the painted legend, H. Lascelles and Company, Preparations and Extracts. A faint light glimmered in an upper room. Lestrade rapped sharply upon the door. After a pause, bolts were drawn, and a thin, spectacled man peered out. "We are closed," he began, but faltered at sight of the inspector's badge. Holmes stepped forward. "You employ, or have employed, a Mr. Edgar Blythe." The chemist hesitated. He assisted briefly, at clerical duties. He left 3 days ago. On what grounds? He was dismissed, the man admitted reluctantly. A discrepancy in inventory, a small quantity of alkaloid extract unaccounted for. Holmes's gaze hardened. Alonatine? The chemist's lips tightened. Yes. Lestrade uttered a low exclamation. Where is he now? I do not know. He collected his wages and departed. Holmes requested to see the storeroom. Though the hour was late, the chemist complied under official pressure. Holmes examined the shelves, the ledgers, the locked cabinet from which the poisons were dispensed. Your records show a deficiency of how much? He asked. Barely a dram, the chemist replied. Yet sufficient, as you know, for grave harm. Holmes nodded. And Mr. How Blythe possessed knowledge of its properties. He asked questions, the chemist conceded. Curious questions. Holmes exchanged a look with Lestrade. Inspector, issue orders to watch the ports and major stations, but our man will not flee tonight. He believes himself unsuspected. He will seek funds. From where? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. From Penwood, a letter, perhaps already written, demanding assistance, couched in terms of familial desperation. If Penwood refuses again, Blythe may attempt blackmail. We repaired at once to Baker Street, where Holmes dispatched a telegram to Penwood warning him to admit no communication and to inform us instantly of any approach. The hours crept past with oppressive slowness. Holmes refused rest, pacing the rug until the first pallor of dawn touched the window. It was shortly after 7 when a boy arrived with a note delivered by hand to Penwood's residence at an early hour and forwarded on to us by express messenger. Holmes tore it open. The handwriting, though careful, bore a tremor. My dear cousin, it began, I am in desperate need of immediate funds. Circumstances beyond my control compel me to seek your assistance once more. Pray meet me this morning at 11 o'clock in the reading room of the British Museum, where we may converse privately. Holmes's smile was thin and cold. He moves precisely as predicted. Lestrade, who had joined us at first light, nodded grimly. We shall have him there. Holmes shook his head. Not in uniform. If he perceives the trap, he may resort to violence or escape in the confusion. We must observe before we seize. And how do you propose to accomplish that? Lestrade demanded. Holmes's expression assumed that peculiar animation which always preceded one of his stratagems. By dividing our roles, Inspector, you and 2 plain-clothes-men will station yourselves near the exits. Watson, you will accompany Penwood openly. I shall be present, but not as myself. You mean to disguise yourself? I asked, though I knew the answer. Indeed, Blythe is cautious. If he glimpses me, he may suspect inquiry, but a foreign scholar bent over folios will attract no notice. Lestrade grunted assent. At 11, then. As Holmes began to assemble the curious apparatus of wigs, pigments, and garments from his battered trunk, I could not but feel that the net had tightened almost to its final knot. Yet I also sensed, from the keen light in his eyes, that some subtle element remained unproven, some final thread connecting poison, crest, and narrow hand. He paused before the mirror, altering the line of his brows. Watson, he said quietly, if Blythe carries upon his person any residue of the alkaloid, he may yet betray himself. Observe his fingers. And if he resists? Holmes's reflection smiled faintly. Then, my dear fellow, we shall see whether a man who traffics in invisible death has the courage to face visible justice. At 11:15 we were assembled within the great circular reading room of the British Museum, that solemn temple of scholarship, wherein the faint rustle of turning pages seems louder than a shout elsewhere. The lofty dome filtered the pale winter light into a subdued radiance. Even the long desks radiating from the centre were sparsely occupied at that early hour. Penwood, pale yet resolute, took his place at one of the desks nearest the central catalogue. I seated myself beside him with an open volume before me, though I confess I read not a word. Lestrade and his men were dispersed discreetly near the principal exits, their plain attire rendering them indistinguishable from other visitors. Of Holmes there was no sign. At precisely 11, a tall, slight gentleman entered, removing his hat with an air of cultivated diffidence. His dark hair was brushed carefully back from a high brow. His coat, though worn at the cuffs, had been pressed with care. I needed no introduction to recognize Edgar Blythe. He paused upon the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping the room with nervous precision. And for an instant they rested upon Penwood. A faint tightening of the mouth betrayed something more than familial embarrassment, an inward calculation. He approached with measured steps. "My dear cousin," he said softly, extending a narrow hand. Penwood rose. "Edgar!" They seated themselves. I affected indifference, turning a page with deliberate leisure while straining to catch their exchange. "You received my note?" Blythe began. "I did," Penwood replied. "You are in need?" "Gravely so." Blythe's voice trembled, though whether from genuine distress or artifice I could not then determine. "Circumstances have conspired against me. An investment, ill-advised." Penwood regarded him steadily. "You have sought assistance before?" "And been refused," Blythe returned, with a flicker of bitterness. "I do not reproach you, yet I assure you, Alistair, that unless I secure funds today, I am undone." Penwood folded his hands. "Undone in what sense?" "In every sense." Blythe leaned forward. "My creditors are not patient men." As he spoke, I observed his fingers upon the desk. They were indeed slender and tapering, the nails closely trimmed. Yet it was not their shape that fixed my attention, but a faint redness about the cuticles, as though irritated by some recent chemical contact. Penwood drew a slow breath. "Edgar, there are matters graver than debt abroad." Blythe's eyes flickered. "What do you mean?" "You have heard nothing?" Penwood asked. "Of what?" Penwood's voice lowered. "A letter bearing my crest addressed to the Queen. It resulted in the death of Sir Renwick Harrowby." For the briefest instant, Blythe's composure fractured. His pupils dilated, and the colour drained from his cheeks. Then, with visible effort, he forced a look of astonishment. "Good God!" he whispered. "How can you speak of such a thing?" Penwood's gaze did not waver. "Because I wrote such a letter, though not with deadly intent?" Blythe recoiled slightly. "You accuse me?" "I accuse no one," Penwood replied. "But I tell you this, the matter is under investigation." At that word, Blythe's eyes darted involuntarily toward the exits. In that moment, a stooped, grey-bearded scholar at the adjacent desk adjusted his spectacles and let fall a slip of paper. As Blythe bent reflexively to retrieve it, the scholar's hand brushed his wrist. "Pray forgive me," the old man murmured, in a faint foreign accent. Blythe stiffened at the touch, then resumed his seat. It was Holmes. I recognized him only by the subtle lift of his brow as he returned to his notes. The contact had been deliberate. Blythe's agitation was now scarcely concealed. "Alistair," he said hurriedly, "if you are in difficulty, we must not be seen together. Provide what assistance you can, and I shall remove myself from the country." "Remove yourself?" Penwood echoed. "Yes, it is best so." The stooped scholar rose quietly and shuffled toward the central desk, passing close behind Blythe once more. As he did so, he allowed a handkerchief to brush the back of Blythe's right hand. I saw Holmes's eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. Blythe drew his hand away sharply. "Confound it," he muttered. Penwood stared. "Edgar, what troubles you?" "Nothing." At that instant Holmes straightened to his full height, I casting aside the stoop as one shrugs off a cloak. "On the contrary, Mr. Blythe," he said, in his own clear voice, "there is something that troubles you greatly." Blythe sprang to his feet. "What is the meaning of this?" Lestrade and his men advanced from their stations, closing the circle with quiet efficiency. Holmes regarded Blythe with cold intensity. "It means, sir, that the faint residue upon your fingers reacts precisely as expected." Blythe's gaze flickered to his hands. "I do not understand." "Permit me to enlighten you," Holmes continued. "When I brushed your wrist, I transferred a harmless reagent. When I later touched you with my handkerchief, I observed the faintest whitening of the skin, a reaction consistent with traces of aconitine." Blythe's composure collapsed. "Absurd." "Is it?" Holmes replied. You handled the poisoned sheets in Mr. Penwood's study. Though you applied the toxin carefully, some minute quantity adhered to your skin. You believed it removed. It was not." Lestrade stepped forward. "Edgar Blythe, I arrest you on suspicion of the murder of Sir Renwick Harrowby and attempted treason against the Crown." For a moment, Blythe stood rigid, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and despair. Then, with a strangled cry, he made as if to dash toward the exit. He had taken but 2 steps before Lestrade's men seized him. As they secured his wrists, Holmes spoke quietly. "You calculated well, Mr. Blythe, but not well enough. You relied upon routine, upon family trust, and upon the invisibility of poison. You did not account for the stubborn persistence of truth." Blythe's head fell forward, when the great dome above us seemed to echo faintly with the rustle of pages, as though the vast knowledge of the ages bore silent witness to the unravelling of his design. The commotion within the reading-room subsided with remarkable swiftness, owing in no small measure to Lestrade's efficient management and Holmes's calm authority. Blythe, pale yet defiant, was conducted from the hall by a side exit, his protests dwindling into sullen silence as the doors closed behind him. Penwood remained seated, his face ashen, his composure shaken not merely by the revelation of guilt, but by the knowledge that treachery had crept so near his hearth. Holmes resumed for a moment the stooped posture of the scholar, gathering his borrowed papers with unhurried precision. Only, when we had quitted the museum and entered the cold brightness of the street, did he permit himself the slightest relaxation of manner. "It is not yet concluded," he said quietly. Lestrade glanced sideways at him. "You have the man, the poison traced to his employer, the residue upon his desk, and the motive of inheritance. What more do you require?" "Certainty," Holmes replied. "We must ensure that no secondary actor remains concealed. Blythe is clever, but clever men sometimes borrow bolder hands." We repaired to Scotland Yard, where Blythe had been placed in an interrogation room. His earlier agitation had given way to a strained composure. He sat erect, though his eyes betrayed the fatigue of a mind pressed too swiftly from calculation into crisis. Holmes declined the offered chair and stood opposite him. "Mr. Blythe," he began, "you have heard the charge. I advise you to consider your position carefully. The evidence is substantial." Blythe's lips curved in a faint, bitter smile. "Circumstantial?" Holmes inclined his head. "In part. Yet the inventory deficiency at Lascelles and Company, the chemical residue in Mr. Penwood's study, your presence there during the unattended interval, your attempt to secure immediate funds and flight, all converge." "You cannot prove I applied poison," Blythe retorted. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You underestimate the minuteness of chemistry. The reagent I employed upon your skin will reveal traces invisible to the naked eye. A more thorough analysis will confirm it. For the first time, a flicker of genuine alarm crossed Blythe's face. Holmes pressed the advantage. But let us speak plainly. Your design was not solely to murder.
It was to implicate Mr. Penwood irrevocably. His crest authenticated the crime. His position ensured scandal. With him disgraced or imprisoned, your path to inheritance cleared. Blythe's composure wavered. You assume much. I deduce, Holmes corrected. Yet there is one aspect which troubles me. Why a second letter? Once the first was dispatched, your fate lay beyond recall. Why compound risk? Blythe hesitated. In that instant I perceived the internal struggle between pride and prudence. Pride won. Because, he said hoarsely, I could not know the first had succeeded. Delay might expose me. I acted swiftly. Holmes nodded slowly. Then you received no word of Sir Renwick's collapse before sending the second? No, Blythe snapped. How could I? Holmes's expression softened by a degree.
That is what I wished to hear. Lestrade frowned. What difference does it make? Holmes turned to him. It confirms the absence of an accomplice within the palace. Had Blythe possessed such a contact, he would have awaited confirmation before repeating the act. His haste betrays isolation. Blythe gave a short, harsh laugh. You credit me with foresight, yet condemn me for impatience. Holmes regarded him steadily. You were patient enough to study the properties of aconitine, to calculate dosage, to prepare the sheets with care. But you erred in one respect. Blythe's eyes flashed. In what? In underestimating the small things, Holmes replied quietly. The minute flake upon the desk, the faint crescent smudge upon the envelope, the irritation of your own skin. You trusted in invisibility, but yet forgot that poison leaves its own signature. Blythe's shoulders sagged imperceptibly. Penwood, who had been admitted to observe, spoke with strained emotion. Edgar, why? You had but to wait. I would have assisted you within reason. Blythe's gaze hardened. Within reason, he echoed bitterly. Your reason left me ruined. I saw no other path. Holmes intervened gently. Desperation does not excuse design. You sought not merely assistance, but advantage purchased with blood. Silence settled upon the room. At length, Blythe bowed his head. I did not intend Sir Renwick to die, he muttered. Holmes's voice remained firm. You intended the letter to be opened. Who opened it was immaterial to your scheme. Blythe did not reply. Lestrade signalled to the constable. That will suffice for now. As Blythe was led away, Holmes exhaled softly. The law will proceed, he said. The chemical analysis will confirm what we already know. Penwood grasped Holmes's hand. You have preserved my honour. Holmes withdrew with characteristic modesty. I have merely followed the path indicated by evidence. Outside, the winter sun had climbed higher, casting a pale brilliance upon the river. I walked beside Holmes in reflective silence. You seemed almost uncertain at the last, I remarked. Only in detail, he replied. The principal structure was clear from the moment we found residue upon the desk. Yet one must never presume completeness. The second letter was the key. It revealed haste, and haste is the enemy of subtlety. And Sir Renwick? I asked. Holmes's expression grew grave. An innocent casualty. His habit of moistening his fingers rendered the poison swift in its effect.
Had he not done so, the dose might have proved insufficient. He paused upon the embankment, gazing across the grey water. Thus, he said softly, A trivial gesture sealed a life. In crime, as in deduction, the smallest action may determine the gravest consequence. I could not but shudder at the truth of his words, for the chain of events, from a cousin's debt to a poisoned letter addressed to the Queen, had hinged upon moments so slight as to escape any eye less vigilant than his. And yet, for all the intricacy of the plot, it had been undone by those same minute threads which Holmes alone possessed the patience to trace. In the days which followed, the machinery of justice advanced with a deliberation as inexorable as Holmes's own reasoning.
The chemical analysis conducted under official supervision confirmed the presence of aconitine upon the seized documents and, more damning still, upon the cuffs and gloves recovered from Blythe's lodgings. The residue matched in composition the extract missing from Lascelles and Company, and the deficiency in the ledger, once a mere irregularity, became a cornerstone of the Crown's case. Holmes took no overt part in these proceedings, yet he remained quietly attentive to each development. I found him one afternoon in Baker Street seated at the table, the original envelope secured within its tin box before him. The winter light slanted thinly through the window, illuminating the faint crystalline sheen along the margin. "You still examine it?" I asked. "Not the poison," he replied. "The intention." He tapped the paper lightly. Observe how evenly the toxin was applied. No clumsy patches, no careless excess. Blythe possessed patience and a steady hand. He had studied not merely the substance but the act. "And yet he faltered," I said. Holmes's lips curved faintly. He faltered in anticipation. He believed the world would move as swiftly as his own thoughts. When news did not arrive, he acted again, compounding exposure. He rose and crossed to the fireplace, where the flames cast restless shadows upon the walls. "Crime," he continued, "is often portrayed as bold or brutal. In truth, it is frequently meticulous, woven with as much care as any scholar's thesis. The difference lies only in the moral thread." The trial of Edgar Blythe commenced within a fortnight. The courtroom was crowded beyond precedent. For the mere suggestion of an attempt upon the sovereign's life had stirred the public imagination to fever pitch. Yet the proceedings were conducted with admirable restraint. The Queen's name was invoked sparingly, and the focus remained upon the murder of Sir Renwick Harrowby. I attended at Holmes's side, though he appeared less interested in the spectacle than in the structure of the argument. When the chemist from Holborn testified to the missing alkaloid, Holmes inclined his head with quiet satisfaction. When Mrs. Darley recounted Blythe's presence in the study during the unattended interval, a murmur rippled through the gallery, and when the expert in toxicology demonstrated how the poison applied to the edges of the paper would enter the system through moistened fingers, I saw more than one listener blanch. Blythe bore the scrutiny with a strained composure that crumbled only once, when Penwood, called to the stand, spoke not in anger, but in sorrow. "I would have aided him," Penwood said simply, "had he but trusted me." At that, Blythe's gaze faltered. Holmes leaned toward me. "Remorse," he whispered, "is often the final and most genuine witness." The verdict, when delivered, was decisive. Blythe was found guilty of murder and of treasonous intent. The sentence pronounced by the judge fell with solemn gravity, and though I shall not dwell upon its particulars, suffice it to say that the law afforded no leniency where such calculated malice was concerned. As we emerged from the court into the chill afternoon air, Lestrade approached with an expression compounded of professional pride and reluctant admiration. "You were correct in every material respect," he said gruffly. "I misjudged the importance of that second letter." Holmes inclined his head. The second letter was the echo that revealed the shape of the first. Lestrade allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "You have a talent for such echoes." When he had taken his leave, I turned to Holmes. "And what of the broader peril?" I asked. "The knowledge that such a letter reached so near its mark." Holmes's expression grew reflective. "Measures have been strengthened, procedures altered. The routine upon which Blythe relied has been revised. It is unlikely that such a method could succeed again." "Yet the vulnerability existed," I pressed. "As it must," Holmes replied calmly. "No system is impervious, only vigilance renders it tolerably secure." We walked in silence for some moments, the city moving about us with its customary indifference. The Thames rolled grey beneath the arches, and the sound of carriage wheels mingled with the cries of vendors. "Holmes," I said at length, "do you feel satisfaction?" He considered before answering. "Satisfaction," he said slowly, "is an emotion best reserved for mathematics. In matters of life and death, one feels only resolution." "And Sir Renwick?" "A casualty of proximity," Holmes replied softly. He stood between the weapon and its intended mark. His diligence cost him dear. That evening, as we sat once more before the fire in Baker Street, Holmes allowed his violin to rest upon his knee. He drew the bow across the strings in a low, meditative phrase, the melody winding through the room like the fading thread of a complex argument. "It is curious," he remarked, pausing between notes, "that a single sheet of paper may carry within it both words and death. One is visible, the other concealed, yet both demand interpretation." I watched him in the glow of the hearth, struck anew by the singular faculty which enabled him to discern within the faintest trace the outline of truth. The affair of the poisoned letter had begun in secrecy and dread, had unfolded through misdirection and calculation, and had ended in the quiet exposure of a mind that mistook cunning for invincibility. And as Holmes resumed his playing, the notes rising and falling with thoughtful precision, I reflected that if evil may cloak itself in the most ordinary of forms, so too may justice reside in the keen eye and patient reason of one remarkable man. Yet the weeks that succeeded the trial brought a gradual quietude to Baker Street, as though the very walls, long accustomed to the tension of whispered counsels and urgent knocks, exhaled at last. Yet the echo of the affair lingered in subtler fashion. A discreet note of thanks conveyed through official channels and couched in language of admirable restraint arrived one morning bearing the unmistakable seal of the palace. Holmes glanced at it only briefly before consigning it to the drawer wherein he kept such communications. "You will not preserve it?" I asked. "The sentiment suffices," he replied lightly. "The paper is of no consequence." But I knew him well enough to perceive that the acknowledgment, though outwardly dismissed, held its own quiet significance. Holmes sought neither decoration nor applause, and yet he was not insensible to the knowledge that his labours had shielded more than a single life. Penwood called upon us once before retiring to the seclusion of his estate. He bore himself with a gravity tempered by gratitude. "My name," he said earnestly, "has been spared public association with the crime. For that I owe you more than I can express." Holmes waved aside the compliment. "You owe me nothing, save perhaps the future precaution of locking your study door." Penwood managed a wan smile. "That lesson is indelibly learned." When he had departed, I observed Holmes regarding the hearth with a thoughtful air. "You remain troubled," I ventured. "Not troubled," he corrected, reflective. Blythe was not a brute. He possessed intelligence, education, even refinement. Or yet he permitted resentment to mature into calculation. "Is that uncommon?" I asked. "Common enough," Holmes replied. "What is uncommon is the precision with which he executed his plan. Had he chosen a cruder method, suspicion might have fallen elsewhere entirely." "And yet you detected him," Holmes's lips curved faintly. Because he relied upon invisibility. He assumed that poison being unseen leaves no footprint. He forgot that application requires contact, and contact leaves trace. He rose and crossed to the mantel, taking up the tin dispatch box which had contained the fatal letter. He weighed it in his hands before setting it down once more. "The smallest flake upon a desk," he murmured, "proved as eloquent as any confession." I could not but marvel again at that faculty which rendered the infinitesimal so potent in his analysis. Where others saw smooth wood and innocent paper, he perceived the faint glimmer of death. The matter might have ended there, but one final thread remained to be drawn taut. A report reached us from the prison physician, detailing Blythe's condition. He had declined steadily, not from physical ailment, but from a species of mental withdrawal. He spoke little, yet had once remarked that the plan had been perfect, save for chance. Holmes, upon hearing this, shook his head. "Not chance," he said. "Error." "What error?" I inquired. "The assumption that systems remain static," he replied. He believed the routine of correspondence immutable, yet it altered the moment suspicion arose. Crime that depends upon unchanging habit is already flawed. That evening, haze fog gathered thickly beyond our windows, and the lamplight cast long shadows across the carpet. Holmes resumed his violin. The melody he drew forth was contemplative rather than triumphant, a weaving of minor phrases that seemed to dwell upon loss as much as resolution. "You speak often of systems," I observed, "of routines and their alteration. Is that the essence of detection?" "In part," he answered without ceasing to play. "Men trust in repetition. They assume tomorrow will resemble today. The criminal exploits that trust. The detective questions it." He lowered the instrument and regarded me with that keen, searching gaze which so often accompanied his philosophical reflections. In this instance, a habit as trivial as moistening one's fingers became fatal. Another habit, leaving a door unlatched, created opportunity. And yet another, my own insistence upon examining the smallest detail, unravelled the scheme. Life is a tapestry of such habits, Watson. Tug one thread, and the pattern shifts. I considered the chain of events, a cousin's grievance, a purloined dram of alkaloid, a letter addressed with studied care, a secretary's unconscious gesture, and the faintest smear upon an envelope. Each had seemed, in isolation, insignificant. Together they had formed a design that reached toward the throne itself. "And what of the future?" I asked. "Do you anticipate similar attempts?" Holmes's expression grew distant. "Where power exists, so too will envy and ambition. The forms may change, the impulse endures, but so long as reason stands vigilant, folly will not pass unchallenged." He returned the violin to its case with deliberate care. "Come, Watson," he said, settling once more into his familiar chair. "There are lesser matters awaiting our attention. A jewel misplaced in Kensington, a curious forgery in Clerkenwell. Compared with poisoned letters, they are almost restful." I smiled at the characteristic understatement. Thus concluded the singular affair of the poisoned letter to Her Majesty, a case wherein death travelled silently upon paper and ambition cloaked itself in familial familiarity. It stands in my memory not merely for the audacity of its conception, but for the delicate chain of reasoning by which my friend exposed its architect. Holmes himself would no doubt dismiss it as another exercise in deduction, no more remarkable than the solving of a cipher or the tracing of a footprint. Yet I cannot forget that in the quiet rooms of Baker Street, amid tobacco smoke and scattered papers, the fate of a realm once trembled upon the faintest crystalline trace, visible only to the eye that knew how to see. In the months that followed the conviction of Edgar Blythe, The affair of the poisoned letter receded from public discourse with a swiftness almost indecent, as though the nation itself preferred not to dwell upon how near calamity had brushed its sovereign head. Official statements were measured, the more sensational details were quietly suppressed. Yet within the narrower circle of those acquainted with the true extent of the peril, the memory endured with sobering clarity. It was upon a damp spring evening, when the first reluctant buds trembled upon the trees of Baker Street, that Holmes and I found ourselves once more reflecting upon the matter. A small parcel had arrived that afternoon, forwarded from the prison authorities, containing certain personal effects of Blythe which bore relevance to the completed case. Among them lay a pocket memorandum book, its leather cover worn thin, its pages filled with cramped, deliberate script. Holmes examined it not with curiosity, but with the same detached scrutiny he might bestow upon an unfamiliar cipher. "His calculations," he observed, turning a page toward the lamplight. "Dosages, intervals, postal schedules." I leaned closer. Columns of figures marched with mathematical precision, interspersed with notations concerning train departures, delivery hours, and the average time required for sorting at Mount Pleasant. "He studied the system as one studies anatomy," I remarked. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "He dissected routine, yet he overlooked variability." He indicated a particular entry. "Collection, 3:15 p.m. Arrival London, 5:40 p.m. Palace delivery before 7 p.m. You see," Holmes continued, "he assumed uniformity. He did not account for the human element, the possibility that Sir Rennick might open the letter at once rather than defer it, that news might not travel to him as swiftly as he imagined, that suspicion, once aroused, would alter procedure." I reflected upon the chain once more, the unlatched door, the unattended desk, the careful brushing of poison along the edges of folded sheets. "And yet," I said, "had Sir Renwick not possessed the habit of moistening his fingers—" Holmes inclined his head gravely. "The effect might have been delayed or diminished. The quantity applied was subtle, sufficient for certainty if absorbed efficiently. Less so otherwise. Blythe sought assurance through chemistry. He found it through custom." He closed the memorandum book and set it aside. "Tell me, Watson," he said, "what do you consider the decisive moment?" I pondered before answering. "The residue upon Penwood's desk had established location." Holmes smiled faintly. "A sound choice. For myself, I would select the second letter." "Because it revealed haste?" "Because it betrayed isolation," he corrected. "Had Blythe possessed intelligence from within the palace, he would have awaited confirmation of success. The repetition demonstrated ignorance. From that, I deduced, he acted alone." "And the crescent smudge?" "A fortunate corroboration," Holmes admitted. "Yet even without it, the convergence of motive, access to poison, or an opportunity within the study would have sufficed." He rose and moved to the window where the fog of earlier weeks had given way to a clearer sky. "There is a tendency," he continued thoughtfully, "to attribute detection to brilliance. In truth, it is accumulation. Each fact, however minute, contributes weight. When the balance tips, the conclusion emerges." I could not resist a smile. "You speak as though it were inevitable." "It is inevitable," Holmes returned, "when one refuses to ignore the small." A knock sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a final communication. It was brief and unsigned, yet unmistakably official in tone. It conveyed, in language restrained but sincere, that measures of correspondence had been revised, and that the vigilance displayed in recent weeks would not be forgotten. Holmes read it and laid it upon the mantel. "Systems altered," he murmured. Blythe's reliance upon habit ensures that his particular method will not easily recur. And yet, I said, another may devise a different scheme. Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet challenge. Then we shall examine that scheme in its turn. He resumed his seat and reached for his violin, drawing from it a melody at once contemplative and resolute. The notes rose and fell with deliberate clarity, as though mirroring the orderly progression of thought that had unravelled the plot. I watched him in the firelight, struck anew by the contrast between the apparent fragility of the instrument and the firmness of the hand that guided it. But so too had the poisoned letter appeared an innocuous object, mere paper and ink, until touched by a mind capable of perceiving the hidden design. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you ever consider how near the Empire came to tragedy?" He lowered the bow and regarded me with a look in which irony and earnestness were curiously mingled. "Nearness is a relative term, Watson. In this case, tragedy stood upon the threshold and knocked. It did not enter. That is sufficient." "And you?" I pressed. "You stand ever upon such thresholds." He dismissed the thought with a slight gesture. "I stand only where reason directs me. The rest is circumstance." The fire burned low as evening deepened. Outside, London moved in its ceaseless rhythm, unaware that a scrap of crystalline powder upon a sheet of paper had once threatened to convulse its heart. And within our modest rooms, the air held once more the familiar mingling of tobacco smoke and quiet industry. Thus ended the case of the poisoned letter, a mystery conceived in resentment, executed with chilling precision, and undone by the patient tracing of details so slight that others had overlooked them. If there is a lesson to be drawn, it lies not in the audacity of the crime, but in the steadfast application of logic against it. For where cunning cloaks itself in subtlety, there must ever remain the counterforce of clear-eyed reason. And in that contest, as I have had the privilege to witness time and again, my friend Sherlock Holmes stands unmatched.